high-stakes poker, four-dimensional chess, or a scene from Dr. Strangelove? Is there a will to reduce the nuclear arsenal, or is it the new membership card for the Great Powers Club? The nuclear clock still seems to be stuck at 5 minutes to midnight. Join me, Darasz, for how we got here.
Miles away, even in brilliant sunshine.
The story of nuclear weapons is, at its core, a story about fear, rivalry, and scientific ambition colliding on a global stage. Their creation was not inevitable, but once the race began, it accelerated with breathtaking speed. The origins trace back to the late 1930s when physicists in Germany discovered nuclear fission. Scientists such as Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann demonstrated that splitting uranium atoms released enormous energy. Alarmed that Nazi Germany might weaponize this discovery, some of the greatest physicist minds in the world, including Albert Einstein, urged the United States to act. Their 1939 letter to President Franklin Delano Roosevelt helped spur the Manhattan Project, a vast, secret US-led effort involving Britain and Canada. Under the scientific direction of J. Robert Oppenheimer and the military leadership of General Leslie Groves, thousands of scientists and workers developed their first nuclear weapon in just 3 years. When the US detonated atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, killing hundreds of thousands of people and forcing Japan's surrender, nuclear weapons were used in warfare for the first and only time. The terrifying scenes in Hiroshima and Nagasaki inspired the father of the bomb to deliver one of the most haunting speeches caught on film.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
The bomb's existence ignited a new kind of competition. Even before World War II ended, the Soviet Union, assisted by intelligence gathered from within the Manhattan Project, began its own program. Instead of ending the nuclear story, the use of the A-bomb in Japan launched a Cold War arms race between Washington and Moscow. The United States and the Soviet Union raced to build larger arsenals, hydrogen bombs, and delivery systems capable of global destruction. By the late 20th century, the sheer scale of stockpiles prompted efforts to limit them. Treaties such as the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, signed in 1968, sought to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons, while bilateral agreements reduced numbers. The new START Treaty, signed in 2010 by the US and Russia, capped deployed strategic warheads and included verification measures. That treaty, however, ran its course this year.
I'm delighted to welcome our guest today, Artur Kacprzyk, an international security analyst at the Polish Institute of International Affairs. Welcome to the programme once more.
Thank you for having me.
We've seen this post-Second World War world, two chief nuclear powers, Soviet Union and the United States, plus France and Britain on the sidelines, if you like, and yet we have the idea of reduction and containment of nuclear weapons. Was this always a contradiction in terms? People would want this weapon, even though it may not be used, even though the chief use of it is not to use it.
To deter others, first and foremost. Some people would say that disarmament and deterrence are two sides of the same coin, but actually, in reality, states always prefer to rely on deterrence. They always rely on the ability, to threaten the other state not to do something, to convince it not to do something, or to be able to defend itself from the other state, rather than trusting or believing that the others will somehow constrain themselves. Yeah. And usually, it needs to get worse before it gets better in terms of disarmament or arms control. In other words, one of the sides or two sides or all of the sides need to understand, if they are to talk in good faith about arms control or any kinds of limitations, that further competition will not be to their benefit, because it will be either risky or costly. And if you look at the history of Cold War in terms of this US-Soviet Union kind of competition, it actually took both states 20 years to start some sort of cooperation and dialogue which bore fruit, actually. Because at first, in 1945, there were US ideas like the Baruch Plan to basically have other countries in the world agree not to have nuclear weapons, to allow inspections of their nuclear facilities, and the US at some point would get rid of its nuclear weapons. Obviously, Soviet Union rejected that plan because the Soviets thought it was a scheme for the US to maintain its nuclear monopoly. And actually, it was only after the 1962 Caribbean or Cuban Missile Crisis that the two superpowers started gradually to somehow cooperate because they got close to war.
Well, did they cooperate on the same intellectual foundation? Did they both think like chess players or like poker players? Did they both have the same framework of entering a negotiation? Because having faith in each other is one of the fundamental ingredients of this, and underneath this web of suspicion, that's not going to be possible.
One can say that everybody has his or her own sense of rationality. So if you look at those bilateral arms control agreements like the SALT treaties from the 70s, which limited the size of nuclear forces of both sides, there was also competition when negotiating them, meaning that one side wanted to constrain the other, but also, to have it done in a way in which, your specific type of capability, for example, in the case of US submarine-launched ballistic missiles, would be constrained less than, for example, let's say, land-launched missiles, which the Soviet Union was very good at. So there were some differences, even after the common goal of somehow capping the arms race was there. And especially in the 70s, there were intense debates in the United States, because some people in the United States believed that actually the Soviet Union is buying the logic of mutual assured destruction. Whereas it turned out that, the Soviets feared that, but they still were, as much as those treaties allowed them to, they were still arming themselves in a way which, in their mind, would allow them to win a nuclear war, or at least not lose it as much as the other side, which then prompted the famous Carter-Reagan era buildup of US nuclear capabilities, driven by the belief that the Soviets are not buying this mutual assured destruction sense of logic.
I remember as a kid having all these drama documentaries, feature films about the nuclear winter, the nuclear war, right, the aftermath of a nuclear war, and it seemed to me that this policy of building up, not to use, to deter, seemed to be working, and so. On reflection, when we look at the first Cold War, was this a successful policy? Not that it reduced the stockpile of nuclear weapons, but that it prevented this huge exchange of nuclear weapons that we were so fearful of.
I would say the deterrence was successful. At the very least, it did not fail. We haven't seen the conflict between two competing superpowers, which rarely happened in human history. So in this sense, it worked. But as we discussed, some things had to happen for the states to somehow try to limit that, arms racing competition. We mentioned the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was one case. And then there was the other intensified arms race in the 1980s. But also other developments. For example, for the US to get in arms control with Soviet Union, the Soviet Union also had to somehow catch up with the US in numbers of nuclear weapons in the 70s. And later, in the 80s, after this, what some people called, a small Cold War period, the Soviet Union was in a very bad shape economically. So even though they wanted to compete with the United States, under the Gorbachev, they actually, at least Gorbachev and some of his advisors, thought that they cannot and that it needs to be slowed down, even though many people, including Vladimir Putin, didn't like some of the treaties signed back then, and it got back to the, and this issue returned after years. But one issue I just wanted to point out, that the Soviet Union and the United States wanted to cooperate on quite early, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, was not just some creating some sort of emergency hotlines to communicate between each other in a crisis, but also preventing the proliferation of nuclear weapons among other states. In the introduction, we've heard about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and it was made largely because both superpowers wanted that to happen, because it was, one thing if United Kingdom or Britain got nuclear weapons, there were, former Soviet allies, sort of, from the Second World War, but it was a way different idea when Germans, the West Germany, started thinking about its nuclear weapons, and when China tested its nuclear weapons.
Right. We'll move on to the post-war world in our next clip. We'll have a look at that first of all.
Sure.
On February 5th, 2026, the new START Treaty expired after 15 years in force. The Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, signed in 2010, was the last existing agreement limiting the size of the nuclear arsenal of the United States and Russia. Combined, these countries possess 90% of the world's nuclear warheads, approximately 3,700 and 4,300 warheads respectively. Under the treaty, both sides could possess up to 1,550 warheads deployed on a total of 700 delivery vehicles, bombers and ballistic missile silos, mobile land-based launchers and submarines. It also provided for mutual exchange of information on strategic nuclear forces and inspections of their bases. Although both Washington and Moscow have signaled that they might continue to respect the old numerical limits politically, without inspections or verification mechanisms, the veil of predictability has thinned. Russia has offered to adhere to limits for another year if the US does the same, but a formal successor treaty is not in negotiation, and the preconditions for fresh arms control are far from ripe. For Europe and Poland, the implications are unsettling. Warsaw, which finds itself on NATO's eastern flank, has long advocated for restraint between the nuclear giants because a bigger and less predictable strategic picture increases the risk of escalation and miscalculation in crises. On the far east of the world, China's arsenal is growing rapidly, and without treaty limits on US or Russian forces, there are fears of an open-ended arms buildup. A broader arms race, involving more actors and advanced delivery systems, could emerge unless new confidence-building measures are negotiated. Reflecting these dangers, the doomsday clock was moved to 85 seconds to midnight in January of 2026, its closest setting ever. The Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists cited rising nuclear risks from eroding arms control as one of the primary reasons for the clock's adjustment. Is a new treaty feasible? In the current geopolitical climate, a fully negotiated successor seems unlikely. High tensions, domestic politics in Washington, and mistrust between capitals make comprehensive limits a remote prospect, though smaller confidence-building agreements remain possible and could pave the way for deeper engagement later.
We've seen the transition from a fundamentally bipolar world, USSR, USA, to a multipolar world. That's probably an accurate assessment of our current state. How does this affect our intellectual capacity to formulate some sort of operational plan to limit the nuclear weapons like we did in the 70s and 80s, as you mentioned? Or is this just too varied, too impossible, too many actors, China, Israel, India, Pakistan, just too many nuclear powers to formulate this kind of rational plan to limit the weapons?
It is increasingly difficult, and I don't foresee actually any kind of arms treaty coming into being soon in the coming years. Because, as you noted, we have new players, especially one new player, China. But even before we get to that, we need to remember that also the relations between West and Russia have changed dramatically, right? We had the first START Treaty, which was actually about reducing nuclear weapons, not about limiting them as SALT treaties from the 70s. We had the START Treaty signed in 1991, then in 2010 the new START Treaty, about which we just heard of, and they were about reducing weapons, and many weapons have been reduced, obviously. Russia and the US have 80% less nuclear weapons today than during the Cold War, but at some point these treaties and others fell victim to Russian agenda. I mean, if you want to reinsert your sphere of influence, and if you think that the nuclear intimidation, that playing with the risk and fear of nuclear war is something you can use against the other side, of course it's extremely difficult for any treaty to hold. And then there's China. It makes it all complicated because you have different players with different sizes of forces, with different interests. And both the INF Treaty, which we haven't mentioned, but I will just mention in a minute, and the New START treaties, they have fallen for similar reasons. INF Treaty, which eliminated a whole class of the medium-range weapons, which basically were deployed in the 80s in that arms race. Yes, SS-20s on one side, on the Soviet side, Pershings and Tomahawks or Griffins on the Western side, and which could have been used very quickly with little warning time for both NATO and the Soviet Union. So they were destroyed under the 1987 INF Treaty. But Russia was always good at building those land-based systems. The treaty has not limited sea-launched and air-launched, which the US was better at. And Vladimir Putin at some point apparently concluded that they need to violate it. They did it secretly. Yes. They always rejected the US accusation about it. But we've seen them now, even after the treaty is gone, very quickly developing some kinds of systems of that type, like Oreshnik. And that system, that treaty disappeared because of Russian cheating, but also because China was never constrained by it. And now China is the primary rival for the United States. So US wanted to free up, first of all, free up its hands to better counter China and have these systems too, but also the treaty wasn't working with relations to Russia. And similarly, recently, you've seen very similar thing happening to New START, because New START was extended by the Biden administration in 2021 and Russia for 5 years, but soon after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Russia suspended the verification regime of that treaty, meaning that they would not exchange information or about nuclear forces, or they would not accept inspections. Why? Because they wanted somehow to frighten the US and force it to limit its support to Ukraine.
Was this a one-sided agreement where the Russian side didn't accept the verification procedures of the inspectors and the United States did, or did the United States also play this game of masking their...
No, after Russia suspended this verification regime in 2022-2023, that was the Russian call, that the Russians did it on their own decision. Then the US responded and they suspended the regime as well, but it was the Russians who did this first. And this is why it wasn't really a good idea for the US to stay under the limits of the treaty after it expired, because as we've heard, Vladimir Putin but offered to Trump to keep on holding to the treaty for 1 year. But this would be a sort of gentleman's agreement, if you can have a gentleman's agreement with Putin. There would be no verification of that. And at the same time, the Americans want a new treaty with both Russia, China included. If not, the Americans want to build up to respond to what China has been doing, and China has a much smaller nuclear force.
About 600, isn't it, something?
Yeah, but they tripled it since 2020, and they are going towards, according to US estimates, 1,000 in 2030 and upwards after that. So the US wants to respond to that. And actually, there was also some additional deployments of Russian nuclear weapons in types of weapons which were not constrained by the treaty, because we need to remember that first and foremost, the New START has never constrained the short and medium-range weapons, so-called non-strategic nuclear weapons. And today, after the Cold War, Russia has many more of these kinds of weapons than US and NATO, and they don't want to limit that at all. In fact, they are introducing additional systems of this type, like Oreshnik, which yes. I mentioned.
Aren't you making the case, or is anybody making the case, looking at the Ukrainian example, they signed their nuclear weapons away, Budapest Accords in the late 1990s, and leave the door open to intimidation and to invasion. Isn't this the case that everybody should, for proliferation of nuclear weapons? Poland should have theirs, Germany perhaps, Finland?
Well, it would be, of course, the best security guarantee for any country to have its own nuclear weapons, but at the same time, many countries don't want to see the others to have them, which is one of the reasons why the NPT treaty was put there in the first place. And now, with the NPT treaty there, it would be very difficult to try to develop nuclear weapons without the rest of the world noticing. And let's remember that today, we hear discussions about countries considering whether to have their own nuclear weapons, which is on one hand because of the aggressive behavior of others. Russia's aggression against Ukraine is a key example, is a key reason, of course, for Europeans. But
India and Pakistan were on the brink of
right.
war a couple of times.
But I think for the US allies, what is important is that they are growing doubts about the US nuclear umbrella. Because we need to remember that the promise to use nuclear weapons to defend allies has been also, for a long time, a non-proliferation tool. Basically, the US would say, we will cover you with our nuclear deterrence, but you don't build nuclear weapons of your own. And now, even though the US is not leaving Europe, is not leaving alliances, all the tensions about things like Greenland or the US desire to focus on Indo-Pacific and China and its own homeland and the Western Hemisphere, all of that causes concerns in Europe. And then there you have those considerations where to have nuclear weapons. But again, a road from considering nuclear weapons to actually having them will be risky, costly, and difficult. Russia might try to preempt that. US might decide to, for example, withdraw its troops from countries which would try to proliferate. So it's a risky business, but it's a natural consideration in an increasingly uncertain world. I don't think we're going to proliferation yet. I think in Europe, right? I think a lot will depend on what the US does and how it manages its alliance policy. Probably the France and Britain, especially the French, can contribute more to nuclear protection of the continent, and that's something what President Macron is supposed to speak soon. So there are variables there. So I don't think anything is guaranteed. But yes, if situations get much worse, proliferation is possible.
It's not. We're talking about nation states, governments, legitimate authorities. But there's also a fear of a small-scale nuclear weapon falling into the hands or being developed by terrorist groups around the world. How real is that to consider?
I think it's not a threat high on the agenda right now. It was definitely in the 2000s after the 9/11, but first and foremost, lots of security protocol security measures have been put in place to prevent that. Second of all, even though we should never neglect the terrorist threat, the terrorist networks have been very much weakened. So I think this is something that states still care about. But when you talk about small nuclear weapons, what comes to my mind is actually some sort of small nuclear weapon being used in a conventional conflict. This is something, for example, that the Russians they have in their doctrine that if they lose a conventional war, they might go first to try to intimidate the other side and tell it basically to surrender or stop fighting.
Okay, why haven't they done that up until now? Their propagandists seem to boast about wiping the UK off the map and all this sort of thing. Is it still very much a chess piece that you play for psychological intimidation?
Well, first and
foremost, or are there theorists who are actually playing these war games through about the actual use of nuclear weapons on both sides?
Absolutely, nuclear weapons are first and foremost there to be used as political tools, not as military tools. By threatening them, you want to achieve something. The problem is that most countries do threaten or warn other countries that they might use nuclear weapons to deter aggression, to prevent war. Now, what we see the Russians doing, they are in many ways, brandishing nuclear weapons or making more or less subtle or tangible threats to also advance aggressive goals. And as you alluded to, that's what they are doing during the war against Ukraine. Yes. They've been threatening other countries not to support Ukraine. That being said, I don't think Russians think as lightly about using nuclear weapons as they would want us to see that. And I think, as also regarding Ukraine and maybe using nuclear weapons there, I think they have feared that this somehow might bring United States and the West into the war. So I think they do believe to some extent in the this extended deterrence U.S. nuclear umbrella. That being said, if they believe it now, it's not granted that they will always believe it, because it always also depends very much on how the U.S. Behaves in the future.
A final short question to you. Does this mean that our consciousness of nuclear wars, I remember when I was a kid, 4 minutes and we were all going to die, all this sort of stuff, is that back on the agenda in terms of our mental view of possible conflict? Or how have we forgotten that, the nuclear threat in the last 30 years or so?
Yes, I think it has been largely forgotten in the West. I don't think that Russia or China or many other countries ever forgot, maybe not the nuclear fear, but the value of nuclear weapons. I think many people in the West, especially in Western Europe, for a long time forgot about the fact that you need also nuclear weapons, and you need to know how to use them to deter the other side. So what I'm saying is that we shouldn't be somehow intimidated by the possibility of nuclear war, because this would give a free pass to authoritarians and totalitarians anywhere to do what they want. But also remember that if you or your allies have nuclear weapons, this way you can also stop the other side from aggression.
Artur Kacprzyk, thank you very much indeed for coming onto the programme.
Thank you so much.
That's it. Join us next time, Tuesdays, 21:35, 35 minutes past 9 CET. So join us then on TVP World.